Welcome back to the Take a Breather podcast with Eric Almeida and Stacy Every. We are certified emotional freedom technique practitioners. Subscribe and give us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts and like and subscribe on YouTube because that really helps support our podcast. On this podcast, part one of our death series was episode 6. We're going to talk about death again today. This is certainly a standalone episode, but feel free to go back to episode 6 if you find this one interesting as well. I'm going to turn it over to Eric.
Yeah, so once again, we are doing a deep dive into death, and our listeners are kind of like, why the hell are they doing this again? But it's just because for us, it's massively fascinating. So like I said, we are going to intimately talk about death. So if that is too triggering for you, either do not listen or feel free to tap along as we're talking if you do get triggered. So our starting topic for today is actually something that I saw on YouTube, which I found to be massively fascinating. So for those of you who might be aware of her, Caitlin Doughty is a mortician based out of California, whose whole concept is about the good death, is about people being able to have an end of life experience that is actually good and positive for them. And in one of her episodes, she talks about the most common fears revolving around death that she actually found. She actually referenced some kind of psychology book now that I think about it, and I don't remember what it was called or who wrote it or anything like that. But I thought it'd be really interesting for Stacy and I just to kind of talk about these, I'm counting them now, 7 major fears around death, and just our perspectives on it, where we feel with that, and just kind of go from there. So, how do we want to do this? Do we want to read them all out, or do one at a time, or what do you
I, I
think?
like to I like to hear the whole list spoken out loud, actually, myself, and then
Sure.
whatever. Both Eric and I have had some experience with death over this past year, and it's one of the reasons why we're talking about it, the integrate, this catharsis and understanding and all of that around the topic. And so, yeah, I'm happy. I find it interesting just to have the whole picture of the most common fears around death.
Absolutely. So what we are going to do is I will read each of the statements so that we're both aware of it, and that you as our listeners and viewers can also be aware of them. And something that I would actually, this is something that Caitlin did, so I'm totally stealing this from her, so I want to give her credit. Um, Keep tabs on yourself. Which one of these or which ones of these bother you the most? Because then
Mm.
it'll really give you a perspective on how to handle it. Because one of the one of the things that Caitlin says all the time is that we will all die. And she's right. We will eventually all die. So it's kind of important for us to be able to be okay with that, but then also live our lives not in fear of death, but also not ignorant of it happening. Two different dichotomies altogether. So we'll do the
It's
7. Yeah, go ahead.
it's the same principle as as EFT practitioners. The phrase I've heard before is you never waste a good trigger. And when you find the things that you find yourself physically responding to with anxiety or anger or any kind of stressful emotion, just making note of it is it's it's um it's really helpful, especially if you practice EFT, because it's a thing that you should and can tap on. I imagine I'll be doing some tapping on one or two or more of these phrases, these fears, before the end. But yeah, it's something you listening as well at home. Like what part of death is the most triggering, and figuring out why. And again, we're doing all these conversations because we feel like death is just not expressly and explicitly discussed nearly enough. When it's going to happen to all of us and to all our loved ones, it just makes sense to have a better sense of our own responses and our own fears around it before we have to be in it.
Absolutely, because COVID put death into the forefront. The way the news media was portraying COVID put it in the forefront with the continuously increasing death counter. And then, Stacy in episode 6 went into a lot of detail in regards to, her father passing. And then with me personally, in 2020, I lost 2 great aunts and an uncle, none of which were COVID related. It was just their time, I guess. So,
Mm.
so let's just jump right in. So the first
Okay.
statement is, I'm afraid to die because my death would cause grief to my relatives and friends. The next one is, I'm afraid to die because all of my ambitions, plans, and projects would come to an end. Third one, I'm afraid to die because I'm worried the process of death might be painful. Number 4, I'm afraid to die because I would no longer be able to have experiences. Number 5, I'm afraid to die because I would no longer be able to care for my dependents. Number 6, I'm afraid to die because I am afraid what would happen to me if there is life after death. And number 7, I'm afraid to die because of what might happen to my body after I die. So for our listeners, Stacy is already tapping. So
So if you're
do
watching on
you
YouTube and you want to learn how to tap, you can watch me on YouTube while I tap.
So do you want to talk about which one came up for you more, or do you want me to talk? Up to you.
uh, do you have something popping into your brain right now? Because I can always talk, especially about this
No,
topic.
no. I just want to give you the space if you want to talk, or if you want more time to get your emotions tapped
Yeah,
down, I
it's more.
guess.
Yeah, it's more. Yeah, it's when so the grieving process. So, for
Mm.
full disclosure, I lost my father in December. It wasn't for COVID. He had a stroke. It was got to be with him at the end, and the first month or so of someone dying is you're pretty numb and overwhelmed and exhausted. I've talked to people since who often get frustrated with themselves. They'll say, "Oh, I'm just so tired all the time. I don't understand what's wrong with me." Like, it's an exhausting experience to grieve. It just saps your energy and your body in a way that's it feels almost alien because you may not even feel sad, but you'll still feel terribly exhausted. And then it goes in waves too. Like so it's been 2 months since he passed, and I've actually felt fairly stable most of the time around him dying. And then for whatever reason, right now I'm having a moment where it's like, oh God, right, he's gone. This is horrible. Death sucks. Um, and for me, I saw this list before. Eric has showed it to me before, and the one that pops out for me as a mother of relatively young children is number 5. I'm afraid to die because I would no longer be able to care for my dependents. And yeah, I can't speak for all parents as far as that goes, but that's certainly, I'd say, the one that gives me some terror about dying is the idea of leaving my kids without their mother when they haven't reached adulthood yet. And um and so and in fact it's the pain of it feels even more strongly now, because that's the other thing about losing a parent that people don't talk about. They say, oh well, your dad was in his late 70s and you're an adult, and I even myself thought that losing a parent is such a it's just what happens to you. It's a one of those quote unquote natural parts of life is your parent dies. Ideally everyone lives a long happy life and your parent dies when they're very old, and but that it would feel almost okay to lose them, but at least it would feel not so devastating. But it doesn't matter. It doesn't, 51 years old, and it was devastating to lose my father. I don't, it's not like I live with him. It's not like I was taking care of him every day. And it still is a overwhelmingly powerfully difficult, challenging, wrenching experience to lose your parent. The end, no matter what. I think even if you're estranged from your parent, I can go into more detail about the another time about just the physical response, because that's kind of I feel like that's a whole conversation by itself, is like the body's response to losing your parent, which is kind of wacky. But so anyway, yeah, that's my death around, around leaving my children is certainly the thing that bothers me the most. But I also, and it's funny, again, this is such an individualized list, right? Like every
Sure.
individual person's going to have a very different take. But for me, another one of the lists on the list that is also very wrenching for me is related to not being able to take care of my children, is not being able to take care of my plans and projects, like
Mm.
the because I have when you create something, be it a business or um, a work of art or a podcast or whatever it is, when you make big plans and you have dreams for your future, you want to make something that's important and that matters and that influences and helps people. The idea of not being able to see those projects to completion, that was definitely it would be devastating if I couldn't. I mean, it sounds awful. I mean, yes, it's going to be horrible if I leave my children, but I won't finish my podcast.
Well,
and
so
I hate to put them next to each other. It's not, they're not the same intensity, but it's still a thing.
It's still a thing. Sure.
Yeah, it's still a fear that I have around dying.
Well, it's funny because so the biggest one for me was worried about the process, that death might be painful. That scares me the most, that the actual act of dying is going to suck. As weird as that is to say.
No, it's not weird at all. I've been in the presence of 2 dying people, and for one of them, it was deeply uncomfortable. And I've done hospice massage and oncology massage as well, and been with clients who were nearing the end of their lives, and it can be very uncomfortable to be going through that process. Absolutely. So I think it's a legitimate concern. We don't know what might happen. We may not know what precipitates our death, and it could be something painful.
Yeah. So that's the biggest one that's certainly the biggest one for me. That the biggest fear is just, it being something prolonged and debilitating, and all that kind of stuff, which I know this, I'm aware of this, and yet I don't have all of the legal protections in place to prevent, being perpetually stuck on life support or something like that. Not all of those are in place. So like, I'm halfway there. So I am younger than Stacy. I'm only 35 at the time of this recording, but so I have a will. That's good. I have a health proxy, so that's good. But I don't have a oh goodness, Caitlin mentions it a bunch of times on her YouTube channel. What is it called when I forget what it's called legally, but it's basically like instructions for what to do in certain situations where I am incapacitated.
Oh, there's some states call it the DNR. There's like
it's kind of
whether when to resuscitate and when not to resuscitate.
Yes, it's kind of like a DNR, but I think it's a different name, and it has more detail to it. But it's so.
Yeah, I learned it was actually something that came up around my father, and it's like a new form. And,
yes.
And DNR was kind of the old one, and now there's a new one that's explicit about this situation, do this, and this situation, do that. And that form is priceless for the person who is wondering what to do for their father who's in the hospital. So
yeah, so like I said, I have the health proxy, so assuming my husband is still alive when I'm in the process of dying, he would have control. But then I'm giving him the responsibility of dealing with me as I'm about to die, which is rough. And then but not giving him clear instructions as to what actually to do. And so and I know in the state of Massachusetts where you and I are, that form, which some people who are listening are probably screaming out loud what the name of the form is, it's free. Like it's something you can, I know we might have to Google it, but it's free. It's literally just a generic form you can just download and fill out and just have somewhere. So I don't know why part of me hasn't just done it, even though I know it needs to be done. So there's that. And then here's the interesting thing, and I'm very. Oh, did you find the name?
No, I might. I'm still looking. You go ahead and keep talking.
Okay. So the other thing that it's there, and I'm acknowledging the fact that I am kind of ignoring this one as well, similar to you. The fear of losing, my ambitions and plans and projects would come to an end. Part of me is certainly embracing the dissonance of I'm only 35. So there is this part of me that is making the assumption of I should get to my late 70s. Like I'm treating life expectancy as a guarantee when it's not. No, that's not to say that I'm doing anything unhealthy. It's not to say I'm taking unnecessary risks per se, but I could still get hit by the proverbial bus. So
Mhm.
it's funny when I think about like if I got struck down right now, my emotional response to that particular fear would actually be anger, like frustration of just being like, God damn it, like I really like this is just starting and I really wanted to enjoy building this, building my business, building the podcast and things like that. So
You'll be an angry ghost.
I'll be an angry ghost. That'll be my unfinished business. I'll be trying to do a podcast post death, and it'll be like that movie Sixth Sense, where you have to like amplify oh my god, people remember this. Amplify the sound because you'll be able to hear me really, really quiet and all that weirdness. And I'm making a 21-year-old reference, I think, that came out in the 2000s. So
I was gonna
Jesus Christ,
say.
I forgot how old that movie really was. And so, yeah, it's just. So I
It's a
will flat admit, my youthfulness is built into like, oh, I've got time. There is that level of dissonance there that I'm aware of.
Absolutely, absolutely, and there's so many reasons to not want to think about it. There's like a huge list. So it's a MOLST form, medical orders for life sustaining treatment. Is the newer
Oh,
version.
okay. That is not
Yep.
the word that Caitlin said, but she might be saying the terminology for California.
She could
So,
be, and also I mean I had gone over my thank goodness my father did in fact fill out some forms. I don't think this is like the newest one, I think.
oh,
They
okay,
keep kind of revising the
sure.
forms to be as explicit as possible for the sake of the family members who have to decide what to do, and having a form that really tells them, really lays it out. And my dad's case, it was very well delineated. And for him there was actually so there's yeah, it's not necessarily going to be as simple, of course, as resuscitate or do not resuscitate. It's when someone has had a stroke or whatever has happened to that person. And in my dad's case, there's an in between space where the oh shoot, I'm gonna forget the term now. When you're going through this, you don't take notes and you forget stuff because you're so stressed out. But so there's do not resuscitate no matter what. Like they don't like
Hmm.
just if I'm infirm, I just want to go and let me go. The end. And then there's the people who say, do everything in your possible to resuscitate me no matter what, to try to save me. And then there's in between where it's basically treat me. It's like it's basically critical care. So you give treatment, and if then the person recovers, then great. And if they don't keep trying to give them treatment.
Mm,
So you give them treatment for a period of time to see if it has a positive impact. So like, yes, put me on a ventilator, but if I have to stay on the ventilator, then take me off the ventilator.
got it.
If you have to resuscitate my heart, great. But if I have another heart attack, then
Let it
just
go.
let it go. So
Okay.
there's like a go ahead and try, but don't try too hard. In between space. And I feel for physicians who have to, I mean, because they're really the ones who have to
Mm,
manage that in between space of like how much care is enough, how much of that critical care is enough. And I can see erring on one side, like, they have to decide,
and
how long do we try dialysis before it's clear his kidneys have failed? How long, how long do we keep him on the ventilator before it's clear he can't breathe on his own? And that's where the physicians have to step in and be put it's inevitable they're put in a situation where they have to make decisions. And that's what, and that's why a lot of physicians, I know a lot of hospitals were just keep them alive at all costs. And then there's, because this is an ambiguous space to be in, for the physician. And I can see
it's
where
their
it would
job
have,
to keep them alive. Yeah.
that's what it has been. That has been the main focus, is that's their main. And it's, again, because it's unambiguous, and then you don't have to worry about lawsuits. I tried everything I possibly could to keep
Hmm.
this person alive, and I can document it all. And so if the bereaved family member wants to sue for whatever reason, they have this very clear, unambiguous, we did everything we could to keep them alive. And then once you get into these in between spaces, I think the most is probably meant to also protect the physician.
Sure.
So there's
And that level of guidance as well, it takes the pressure off of the people who are at the bedside of like, what does this person who is unconscious want? Do they want every form of do they want to get a hamster heart transplant if it's going to keep them alive, or like, or are they more in the realm of, oh my god, like I'm 89, what are you even, like, don't even bother, like I'm ready to go, like just let me walk out, walk towards the light, kind of thing.
absolutely,
So
and it's such a gift my father gave me, and that anyone can give their loved ones, is because at some point the physician says to us, "What do you want to do?" And being able to say it's clear from the most and from what he's told us that he does not want to be kept alive. We still have to say to them, take him off all life support, which is a staggeringly painful thing to do, even when you know it's the right thing. And I'm not sure how much of that has to do with cultural conditioning, because I've grown up in a world where, in fact, life at all costs has been the rule of the day. I mean, most of my history with medicine, getting permission to die, they made movies about it, how incredibly difficult it was
mhm.
to be, like, people wanted to die and they basically had to go to court for the right to die in the 70s and such, and probably even the 80s, for all I know. I don't know the exact history, but that's the exposure I had around death. So being in a world where I get to say, no, I think it's time to let him go, it's it's a it's it's a gift I gave my father, and it was the right thing to do, and it was still incredibly difficult.
Yeah, and that is one of those interesting things that is very specific to the United States about the keep them alive at any cost as the default, because like, so I'm first generation in this country. So I was born here, but all of my parent generation and older were came from Portugal. And I can tell you now, at least in Portugal, it's not like that at all. It's very much, they have more of a mentality, at least from what I've been exposed to, they have more of a mentality of, when you're old and infirm and you start becoming a nuisance to your family, to just kind of
Is that
just
the word?
stop.
Is that the word we use?
Well,
Or
nuisance,
just
burden, like they have more of that mentality of like let me give you a perfect example. My great grandmother. So I got lucky. I met all of my great grandparents on my mother's side. Dumb luck
wow,
there. But I
wow.
never met my grandparents on my father's side. Just how that one worked out. And so actually neither did my mom, which is weird. They died very young, my
Hmm.
dad's parents. So my great grandmother, she had a stroke, and then she was bedridden for the rest of her life until she passed away. If she was in the United States with the mentality of recover at any cost, she probably would have walked again. But the mentality in Portugal was just, she's old, she had a stroke. We're happy she didn't die, but why are you like what's the point? That's kind of like, it's like,
Hmm.
what's the point? And so,
Mm-hmm.
like with my,
Thing.
it's very different from the States. So
Mm.
like for example, when my uncle died, so my father's older brother, he died because, so I'm so I'm getting this fragments of information translated from Portuguese into English. So this is a very fragmented amount of medical information, so bear with me. So
Uh-huh.
he had some kind of blockage in his digestive system,
Oh, okay.
which basically stopped him from being able to go to the bathroom.
Yeah, it could be like a
Whether
torzon or something in the
whether it was
intestines.
urinary or intestinal, I don't know.
Yeah.
It was able to be surgically repaired, but because of his weight and the condition of his heart, the anesthesia would have killed him. And so
Mm.
they kept him comfortable, and then he passed away a couple of days later in the hospital. So
Mm.
if that was the States, I don't know. I don't know if the option would have been do the surgery, like and see if you could keep him alive. Because the option they picked was he's
Good
going
question.
to die no matter what. If they don't do anything, he will
Right.
die, and he did. The other option would be like that's the classic example of like, if there's a 10% chance or a 5% chance that you won't die from this surgery, would you take it? And so that's the big shrug of like, I don't know how much the culture played a factor into that.
Right.
So I don't know. Like, that's one of those, like, Americans, at least
And
from what I've seen, would be willing to roll the dice depending on their quality of life. But you were going to say
I,
something.
yeah, I guess that's, there are things that should not be legislated and that should be taken up as my opinion is that there are things that should be personal responsibility as much as possible taken care of. There's things that the person should take care of and take on as their personal responsibility, and thinking about their end of life care, what they want for themselves should they become sick or hit by the bus or whatever, sorry to be kind of crass, whatever else might happen to us, and letting our loved ones know what we want is all that should be our decision. That's just makes sense from every possible situation I could think of, is that we just have to think about this. We have to think about death. We have to think about what death means to us personally, how we want to go, what we can do to protect our loved ones when we do die. Like, that's all just, it's just another part of being an adult, needs to be thinking about our end. And there's, because there's so many things that if we ignore them long enough and we never have to think about it, it's just so catastrophic on the other end if we don't have any sort of plan or conversation. I mean, if I didn't know what my father wanted, it would have been terrible. I
Mm.
At the end of things, by the very end, it was clear that the physicians will never say, I think. They rarely, even after it turned out he had 3 strokes, and even then they did not say it's time to let him go. They just
I
said,
don't think they can.
right, it's still up to me and Mindy. And for us, since Dad had talked about it, if he had never talked about what he wanted and never gave us a clue of what was important to him and what wasn't important to him, asking it would have been just a horribly grueling. It's a horrible experience no matter what. And to
Mm-hmm.
make it even more grueling and devastating and emotionally traumatic for the people left behind, and then who have to decide whether to keep you alive and be in a nursing home the rest of your life, making, like, us making that decision for you, it's it's terribly unfair.
Yeah, and that's something too that is so difficult for most adults to understand is, we were born as children and have to and are dependents by default, and then we become adults, and assuming you hit life expectancy, for the majority of our lives, our existence, we have the autonomy to dictate our lives. But depending where we are at the end of our lives, if we have a decline, we end up becoming infantilized again. And you see that a lot where, you know, the parents are rebelling against their children, treating them as children, where like they get the role reversal there of the child now becomes the parent becomes the child, because the parent is no longer capable of taking care of themselves. And there's so many people who I can sympathize with that. I couldn't imagine having my autonomy taken from me in that way, taken from me due to age. Because, like, granted, I'm saying this now as a 35-year-old, but like the thought of needing someone to wipe my ass, like to have that level of fundamental care, like indefinitely until I die, I don't know if that is worth living anymore. Like it
And
really would.
that's the kind of thing that everyone should think up. Yes, that is on the list of things to think about when it comes to this situation.
But that's the really complicated part. That's where you might go into the realm of euthanasia, which is such a triggering topic there, because you might be
Hmm.
talking about a person who is cognitively intact and biologically relatively intact, but just infirm to a point, if I'm using that word right, like
I think so.
infirm to a point where their basic functions they can't do alone anymore. Like they're basically bedridden. So someone has to
Mm.
feed them. Someone has, like, yes, they can chew the food and digest the food. So their body in that regard is working enough. But then you basically have what would be the equivalent of an elderly infant, where someone literally needs to change the diaper and spoon feed them. Like that's
And that's
that's a horrible
and that
existence.
it does sound like a nightmare to a lot of people, and I think there's interesting gray areas here. You said the word autonomy,
Mm.
which pinged something for me. Yeah, there's different versions of autonomy, or say it that way, if that's quite what I mean. So I'm processing as over the live here.
It's
When,
okay.
well, so much autonomy is being able to make choices for yourself, right? Like that's one
Yes.
of the fundamental definitions of autonomy. So choosing to stay alive and choosing to accept your body as it
Mm.
is, needing care, is a kind of that's a choice we can make, and that doesn't, as you say, because you said the phrase having my autonomy taken away from me.
Yes.
And that's an interesting, there's a couple, there's so many different ways we think about our health and our bodies and what we should have control over and what we don't have control over. And the body's aging process can be seen as, and I think is seen culturally as this horrifying, um, to be fought to the last breath process that we will reject and fight against and do everything in our power to avoid. And yet we still age and become infirm and die eventually. So I mean, it's something my father struggled with for the last 10 years, was his deep anger at the failure of his body. He really didn't
Mm.
stop, like, from his first diagnosis of a medical condition, a neurological disorder. He was really deeply angry for the next 10 years. And I get what he was angry about. He was an extremely hale and hearty man. He had a very full life. He was athletic, and he traveled, and he had a lot of friends, and he worked out, and rode bikes and did all these things. And so having this is a huge part of how he saw himself taken away from him. And he never was able to move past that grief and anger over that loss.
Mm.
And that's a whole inner growth process, right? Like us getting older and losing control over what happens to our body. It's part of spiritual growth, honestly. I mean, anyone who's had a chronic illness will say that often
Yeah.
chronic illness is opportunity for spiritual growth, because you can't see yourself in the same way anymore. You have, either you stay you stay in that place of anger and grief and despair and wishing you were still as you were, or you work to process the grief and the anger and the despair and see what you are besides being chronically ill, and besides being a strong, hale, hearty body. What else are you? Who else are you beyond the illness? And it's and more people, smarter people have written about this, about the opportunity of illness
Mm.
is to discover other. It's certainly not a fun way to go through it, but often we have our most intense and productive spiritual growth when we have something really difficult in our lives. And that happens over and over again. Just, some big events, divorces and deaths and illness are all the kinds of things that are wrenching and provide incredible opportunity for our own personal, uh, being like the most adult, actualized being we possibly can. And then you can talk about, is that why we're here? To become actualized, constantly growing, wise beings who become wise through challenges and difficulties, more so than the easy years.
Yeah, no, that was what you just described was a big component of that denial of death book that I mentioned to you that took me so freaking long to read because it was freaking dense as hell, by Ernest Becker. But that was one of the fundamental things that he was talking about, was our consciousness has this perception of immortality and everlastingness, but our bodies
Mm.
are not. And
Mm.
that we have to live with that dichotomy of feeling that our consciousness is forever going, but that we still are an animal at the end of the day. That we are in that our bodies will age and decay and die, and that fundamentally we don't know what happens to the consciousness after that. That's where
Mhm.
you go into philosophy and religion and all that. Is there a soul? Is there an afterlife? Or is it just the lights go out and you're done? And it's a complicated thing to process and to even imagine. And that was a big component of what he was talking about in that book, was how he was trying to explain how he thinks people in general handle that dichotomy, and how they and what they do with that. And
Mm.
so his fundamental conclusion, if I'm getting it right, is that the 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 underlying fear of death is the primary driving force of us being alive. That
Mm.
we try to find things to fulfill us in life because we know that we don't have an infinite amount of time. That could be career, that could be creation, whether it's a podcast or art or a business, that could be children, that could be family, that could be love, that could be simple experience. And that was his primary hypothesis, is that all of our drives in life are because we're running from we're trying to erase the fact that we're going to die,
Mm.
essentially.
Mhm.
And so it was
Hmm.
it was an interesting book. It was certainly a dense and relatively dark book to be reading over a span of 2 months, but
Well,
it was interesting.
yeah, well, I like I I resonate with the, because I've run across this idea before that the human being is fundamentally an animal that creates,
Mm.
you
Oh
know,
yeah.
and even more so maybe than other types of animals because we make art and music and media and everything else that we can make beyond children. Um, is children being just one aspect of our drive to create. That it's one of our fundamental, um, reasons for being, for our, and it also feels to me that it's also a another pathway to spiritual growth, the act of creation. I mean, I've talked before about how you know building my own business has been a huge spiritual growth opportunity.
Whether you want it to be or not.
Whether you want it to be or not, and any endeavor, right? I mean, it's one thing, there's the artist who works in their room and makes their pictures or their sculptures or their writing, and they never show it to anyone. And it's the letting the creation loose in the world that is where the growth comes from, right? And having people respond, see what you create and how it takes on a life of its own, and other people's response to it is such a, I mean, it's such an invigorating aspect of being alive, and I don't know if it's if it's our it's it, I there's a term in permaculture called function stacking, that when you're planting a garden, they're all over creating garden environments where each plant serves more than one purpose. So you'll have a tree that provides shade for the shade loving plants and has fruit to feed you, and is a windbreak for the rest of the garden. And then you'll have you'll have plants that specifically attract bees and birds, and also feed the soil, and also are really pretty to look at, right? And I think the act of creation is the same way. It may in fact be our raging against the end of this body and the end of this life,
Mm.
is I must create in order to counteract the horror of my non-existence. But it's also serves the purpose of spiritual growth and for opportunities for connection to others, and for expanding our understanding of the world, and if we are here in fact to just broaden it, was the idea that we are God trying to understand itself.
Ooh, that's an interesting statement. Yeah.
I'm not the one who made it up.
Well, no, it's funny because like I was just, as you were saying that, like I was thinking back to like, all this talk of creation. You and I are having, you and I are having so much fun and enjoyment with creating this podcast, for example. But
Yes.
here's an interesting question. If we knew that we were never going to release it, would we have as much fun?
I know my answer. What's yours?
I think it would be hollow without
I
knowing that there could be, that there, like, I think the excitement and the hope of there being a listener and a viewer is what's adding to the excitement of someone else appreciating our creation.
Yes.
Are you in the same boat?
Absolutely. I have no interest in uh, chatting. I mean, one reason we started this podcast, I mean, besides you saying, "Hey, Stacy, you want to have a podcast?" but I blame you entirely for that.
I'll take that. That's fine. Well, I didn't
But
want to make YouTube videos by myself, so.
Yes, and I mean, honestly, it's something I would never have thought to do a podcast because I've only heard people doing them by themselves, and I didn't have much interest in talking to myself. I don't, whereas the synergy of collaboration is just
Yes.
so much more rich and interesting to me. And frankly, that's what we basically said is we should just sit down and hit record because we end up talking about pretty interesting and deep things, and then
A
the
lot,
synergy of
yes. A lot of
and
interesting conversations have been lost to the ephemera.
I know. Darn it for not having the foresight to hit record when we had the chance. But so there's I mean, part of it I think is this is it's a thing, right? The collective genius, right?
Yes.
It's the consciousness of connection and the interconnectedness of all things on my part. Back to like the holistic mind, being holistically minded. I'm so frustrated with the common conception that still seems to continue that Bill Gates is responsible for Microsoft, Steve Jobs is responsible for Apple. Like, they didn't do it by themselves. For God, Jeff Bezos didn't make Amazon happen. All of them had these teams of people who, and I've said this before, who made it happen. There's a fascinating, it's depressing, but there's a fascinating book called The Making of the Atomic Bomb that I read for some reason, even though I don't usually have interest in those things. But it's a monster book going through 100 years of science that, and they track every discovery, every understanding that led to the ability to produce an atomic bomb, and built on years and years and years of sweat, blood, and tears from scientists before. And so and that's our opportunity, right? Is we put our little podcast out into the world and someone hears a thing and says, oh, that gives me this idea to do this thing, or this gives me a better understanding of that thing. And it's the collective genius, and we want to contribute to the collective genius and help everything be better. Like, that's the point, right? Like, that for me is progress. I'm not a big linear, like, progress is the most important thing ever. It's linear progression of things being bigger and better and faster and stronger and all that. It's progressive as in more understanding, more collaboration, more spiritual growth, more connectivity, more wisdom for all of us.
Yeah, and like one of the things that drew me into wanting to create the podcast as well was just witnessing, as a listener of other people's podcasts, that natural collaboration of just having the conversation. And then just that level of engagement that happens, and then like the interesting sparks of knowledge and wisdom as a listener, or even amongst each other that are performing the podcast itself. And so it just I lost my train of thought. Oh God, I think it's gone altogether.
I can speak to that too.
It's
I mean,
gone.
I feel like we're getting so much. I know I'm getting so much smarter having conversations with these brilliant guests we're up to 2 guests so far. We have many more scheduled, and I'm very excited to talk to all these wonderful people. But
yes, it came back.
Oh, good. I was hoping so.
Yeah, no, it came back. So It's the shit. I lost it again. No, no. Okay. It's the my personal level of engagement in the creation of it. It's tapping into something within myself that feels so fulfilling that I want to chase it. There's
Hmm.
something about the conversations that you and I have been having, whether we recorded them or not, or the interviews that we've done so far and the ones that are coming up. There's something about this moment right now, talking to you, recording this right now. There's something about this exchange of just ideas and thoughts in the fly organically and naturally that for me makes me feel in this moment alive
Hmm.
more so than the hundreds of thousands of hours I've wasted watching TV or playing video games. Like, yes, there's enjoyment there, but right now I think there is something in this creative space that we're in right now in this conversation. There's something that is, I can't even put a word to it, but precious isn't right. It just, there's something of real substance to it. There's something
Mm-hmm.
of just real
Something
spark,
fundamental. Yeah.
fundamental.
Yeah.
And it's something that's just, it makes it makes me feel alive. And that's why it's one of the driving things that makes me want to do it. Like we've even had those conversations of like, you know, of the how much like doing the podcast is something that is like we're so enthusiastic to do that it makes us like we're just like let's just keep doing more episodes. It's so much fun. Like and it is. It's something about this communal creation, and then putting it out there in the world. And you know, if we have 10 listeners, it's still 10 listeners that it has an impact on. You know, if we have 1,000 listeners, even more. If it goes higher and higher, even more, which is crazy. But it's still recording, it's still capturing this moment for what it is. Like, capturing this ephemeral moment in perpetuity, even if we replayed it ourselves, it's not the same thing. It's what is that? It's that whole we've all I hope to God every human being has experienced at least more than once, where you have those moments where you know that what you're doing is really special, that
Hmm.
moment that you're having is so special, and that you're truly content, but you also know it will end. And yes, we're
Hmm.
capturing this creation right now, but even if we replay it back, it won't be the same for you and I. It might be something unique for the listeners, but not for us, because for us
Mm-hmm.
it's past. And so yeah, as the sun continues to go into my face. I need to get curtains. But
It's
yeah.
the ephemeralness of it does lend that edgy specialness to it. It edges everything with that golden specialness that you can't get any other way.
And this is going to sound very bizarre, but that is what makes the fact that we will die a necessity for us being human. If we were, this is gonna sound very odd, but
I
for
doubt it.
as long as I was big into sci-fi. I was huge like Buffy
Same.
the yeah huge Buffy the Vampire Slayer and stuff like
Yes,
that. You
Buffy.
can't go wrong with Buffy. But like
Yes.
and part of being a vampire in that lore, and most vampire lore, is the immortality component of it. Yes, you can die, but you won't die from aging. Like you'd have to be killed essentially.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember even at a very, very young age, never wanting to be immortal. As weird as that might sound, there was some part of me that was always like, no, I don't want to live forever. I want this to end. I don't want it to end now. I don't want it to end soon, but I do want it to end. And there's something about like that might sound very odd to people, but
Well, I
it
think
would
it
take
sounds.
away the ephemeralness of life
I,
if you would never end.
I think I hadn't internalized so clearly before why that that things being ephemeral is critical for them being special or them being as not even just special, just having the spark, the vital spark in them, because they can't last. And yet taking away that vitality is, yeah, I mean, that's what we're talking. Taking away vitality, that means less life. Ironically, if you're immortal, you have less life, because that spark of the spark that comes from something being ephemeral is taken away. And
Yeah.
I think it only sounds weird to say that, because of all those fears that we started the podcast with, around things that, I mean, so much of the fears we have to do, it's the fear of the unknown, right? And not trusting the unknown either. You know,
Hmm.
not trusting our loved ones to be able to manage without us, or um, not trusting that our creations we have managed to produce are going to just aren't important enough, or aren't going to go anywhere. Um, that, you know, not knowing about what death is going to feel like, the
Hmm.
process itself. And one reason for that is we never get to see it. You know, it's hidden away in hospitals, especially now.
Yep.
You know, dying process is hidden away in hospitals. You know, doctors take care of the dying process rather than people dying at home. Although, you know, with hospice care, that's changed quite a bit, but still, I'm sure it's more prevalent to people to die in the hospital, being taken care of by strangers, and the fear of that. Um, you know, the life after death question, when people give up, you know, so much has been, I think religion, that's another whole conversation, and we're going to dive, we're going to do death and religion, and really trigger people, like, okay guys,
Oh
get ready,
Lord.
all right folks, get ready to tap, we're going to talk about religion now. But no, spirituality, the loss of spirituality for a lot of
Hmm.
us is another, creates even more unknown around death. So I feel so much around dying, the fear is about the unknown, because I mean, goodness knows the
Yes.
human body hates it's, you know, it feels very threatening to have huge areas of unknown. And then the less we talk about it, it's even more unknown. The less we see it, talk about it, discuss it, process it, just the fear just gets hiked up even more. So
And that's
um
the really interesting thing too, because we're not happy on either side of that spectrum. So if life was perpetual novelty, it would be overwhelming. We need some
yeah.
semblance of something consistent for us to not be completely overwhelmed. If every day was completely, if every day had no pattern to it from the day before, we would be overwhelmed as human beings. We can't handle that much novelty. But you go to the other extreme. If every day was exactly the same, we would die from boredom.
Yes.
And so it's so funny. We're trying to find this balance of, you know, having enough novelty for us to keep wanting to keep going, but having enough security and enough consistency for us to have a semblance of safety.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the kind of the back and forth. And you're right, when it comes to death, because we don't know what's there, we don't know what's after that. There is that, and no one has been able to tell us reliably what's after that. Um, we it's no evolutionarily, it's no different than us looking at a cave that we can't see into. It activates the fear.
Mm-hmm.
What's in there? Is it dangerous? Is it going to kill? Like, ironically, you're talking about death, but like, is there a bear in there? Am I in danger if I go in there? And so, but that's that same thing. It's, we don't get an answer for that until we die. But that's the thing, when we die, we theoretically can't come back and say, hey, this is what happens. We, unlike every other form of experience that exists, there's usually someone who can tell you about it
Right.
under most circumstances, and we don't get that.
No, but we can have more conversations with people who are dying, and being, and at least some of the things around
Yes.
death, we can in fact
Yes.
gain some sense of connection and comfort to, you know, thinking about our own deaths and talking about them with our loved ones, and then being with our loved ones, like really being there for people who are chronically ill and who are dying, and not being afraid to listen to them and their
And that that
experiences.
was that was a really big thing that Caitlin Doughty was saying. Is This is going to sound funny too, just based on what we're used to right now in the Western world. When a person has died, so they're dead, that is not, that is there, it is no longer an emergency. That we have, I myself believed it up until I watched enough of her your YouTube episodes, but there is this belief that when a person passes, you immediately need to do something with the body because it's instantly going to just be rotting away and be disgusting.
Mm-hmm.
That's not true per se. It actually takes a lot longer for noticeable forms of decay to happen. And so that is one of the things that she actually pushes where she is in California, is actually home funerals, because she was saying that you don't have, like, she was saying you can, like, if the person that you love passed away in your home, in their home, you can stay with them for a while. She was saying you could stay with them for hours before you have to even do anything. And then she was saying you could stay with them for days as long as you keep them cool. You know, get some ice packs or pump the AC, and you still would not be noticeable for a couple of days before it becomes more where you need to do something something more profound. And that is something that, like, and she was saying, like, that is what humanity has done for most of existence. It's only the modern funeral industrial complex, I think is her terminology, that has changed that as saying you need to get it out now. Like, that's dangerous, it's not safe, you could get sick. All of that's not true. With, you know, I think with the exception of Ebola, you're not going to get a disease from a body that has passed away, with the exception of a very, very, very few, and those are ones where they would be quarantined in a hospital anyway. Even
Right.
COVID, as far as I'm aware, is not. There's been no discussion that I'm aware of that you can catch it from a body. Like, I'm not hearing of funeral directors and things like that catching COVID from patients who passed away. So it's, yeah.
So it's again about respecting the person's wishes, respecting our own desires and needs around this issue, respecting the body itself when it passes, respecting the process we need to go through when the person is going through when they're dying, and that we need to go through when we're witnessing a death, and being present to the experience and honoring the experience as another gift we can give our loved ones by being there for them and carrying out their wishes and supporting them, and then carrying out their wishes after the fact, and supporting each other through the grieving process. And that all by itself, I think, would help so much with our own fears around death. Just having those the respect and the connections and the love.
No, I totally agree. And I think that's a perfect place to stop, of just honoring everything that comes with that, including, like, just like you said, and honoring one's own emotions around our own eventual passing with that of those around us. So thank you, listeners and viewers, for joining us again on another episode about death. I anticipate there's a high probability of a part 3, so you've been warned. And
I know I'm not done.
yeah, no, this is a big chunk of of a lot of the random topics we were wanting to talk about, but yeah, there's still plenty more to go.
Yes.
But thank you again for joining us, and
Yes,
we'll
thank
talk to you
you.
again next week.